Please, do not let him see the bag. 2 minutes, that is all I am asking. It was 9:10 on a Thursday night in November, outside a shelter with peeling paint in Yeongdeungpo, when Adaeze Okafor heard the whisper through the fence and did not stop kneading the dough on her forearm. She had flour to her elbow and a delivery due in 40 minutes, and the woman pressing herself into the shadow by the gate was shaking so hard the plastic bag in her hand rattled like dry leaves. Behind that woman, at the mouth of the alley, 2 men stood with their hands in their coats, waiting with the patience of people who were paid by the hour. Adaeze had lived in Seoul 4 years on a visa that forgave nothing and forgot no one, and every rule she had learned said to close the shutter, lock it twice, and remember nothing in the morning. She expected to do what every sensible woman in her position did, which was nothing. Say she had seen no one, heard no one, owed no one. That was the arrangement she had made with the city the day she landed. Work hard, stay invisible, let other people's trouble stay other people's. The shelter director, a tired man named Mr. Yang, had told her once that the 2 men worked for a loan office 2 blocks over, and that the office belonged, in some folded paper way nobody liked to trace too far, to a construction conglomerate whose name was printed on cranes across half the city. What Adaeze did instead was set down the tray, wipe her hands on her apron, and open the gate before the woman could knock again. She did not know yet that a black car had been parked across the street for 11 minutes. Engine off, a man in the back seat watching her hands move, with an attention he had not given anything in a long time. Inside, the bakery kitchen smelled of yeast and burnt sugar, the ovens still ticking as they cooled. Adaeze pulled the frightened woman past the flour sacks and sat her on an overturned crate, and only then did she see what was inside the plastic bag. Not money, not documents, but a child's shoes, small and new, the tags still stapled to the soles. The woman's name was Jiun, and she worked the register at a convenience store 2 subway stops away, and the men outside were collecting on a debt her husband had signed for and then disappeared from, leaving her raising a 6-year-old on tips and fear. Adaeze had heard versions of this story in 3 languages since she arrived in Korea, and every time it cost her something to listen instead of turning away, because listening was never free, not for a woman whose visa depended on a spotless record and an employer who did not want trouble parked outside his shop. Everyone at the shelter's board meetings had agreed, without ever needing to say it aloud, that Adaeze was there to bake bread for the donation table and nothing more. A pleasant, hard-working woman who would be gone the moment her contract ran out, useful the way a good appliance is useful. Nobody in that gray-carpeted room had thought to wonder what she did with the hours nobody paid her for. What she did that night was walk Jiun out through the back delivery door, past the dumpsters, into a taxi she paid for herself, and stand at the mouth of the alley afterward, alone, facing 2 men twice her size, until they got the message that the woman they wanted had already gone. She did not know that the man in the black car had gotten out to watch the last 3 minutes of it from the corner, phone forgotten in his hand, and that by morning he would have her name, her employer, and a question he could not put down. The Han Sky Group Tower did not look like a place where anyone remembered the names of bakery workers, and that was precisely the point of towers like it. 41 floors of tinted glass rose over Yeongdeungpo, and on the 4th of them, in an office with a view of nothing but another tower's reflection, Han Tae-min read the same paragraph of a supplier contract for the 3rd time without absorbing a single word. He was 38, chairman in all but title since his father's stroke 18 months earlier, and the men who ran his construction division reported that a loan office bearing the Han name in its paperwork's fine print had sent collectors to intimidate a widow over a debt inherited from a dead husband. Tae-min had not authorized it. He had also not stopped it, because stopping it meant admitting he did not read every appendix of every subsidiary his father had folded into the empire, and admitting that felt, to a man raised on precision, like admitting he was not fit to hold what he had been handed. He closed the contract and asked his assistant for the shelter's address instead, and told no one why. The shelter occupied the ground floor of a converted printing house, its bricks softened by decades of rain, and Mr. Yang, the director, met him at the door with the particular caution reserved for men whose suits cost more than the shelter's monthly budget. Tae-min said he was there about a donation, which was true in the way that half-truths are true, engineered to survive a follow-up question. He was led through a hallway lined with children's drawings to the small kitchen at the back, where flour hung in the air like fog, and a woman with her sleeves rolled to the elbow was arguing, cheerfully and without backing down, with a delivery driver about a crate of eggs that had arrived cracked. She had a head wrap the color of terracotta and a voice that carried without being loud, and she settled the argument by simply taking the crate from the driver's hands and finding, without looking, the eggs that had survived. Tae-min stood in the doorway a moment too long, and Mr. Yang, following his gaze, said her name was Adieze, that she volunteered 3 mornings a week besides her paid shift at a bakery down the road, and that she was, in his words, the reason the children ate breakfast that did not come from a vending machine. He did not introduce himself. He watched her divide the surviving eggs between 2 trays with the economy of someone who had run out of things to waste a long time ago, and he thought, with an unfamiliar clarity, that he had not seen anyone move through a room like they owned only the task in front of them and nothing else in years. Everyone in his own building moved like they were being filmed. He left without the donation conversation he had rehearsed and sat in the car outside for 4 minutes before telling the driver to go, turning over the shape of a decision he had not yet made and could not yet name, while behind him the shelter's lights stayed on, warm and unbothered, indifferent to the tower he was returning to. Adiaze's own apartment sat above a laundromat in Guro, one room with a kitchenette she had bargained the landlord down on by pointing out, in fluent and unhurried Korean, every crack he had promised to fix and never had. She had learned the language less from classes, which she could not afford, than from customers at the bakery, from the elderly woman upstairs who corrected her grammar over shared kimchi on Sundays, from 6 seasons of a drama she had watched with subtitles until she no longer needed them. Her mother back in Enugu called every Sunday at exactly the same hour, and every Sunday asked the same question in a tone meant to sound casual and never quite managing it, whether Adieze had met anyone, whether she was still planning to come home, whether the money she sent was enough now that her younger brother's school fees had gone up again. Adieze answered honestly about the money and vaguely about everything else, because the truth was that she had built a life in Seoul out of small, specific loyalties. The bakery owner who had sponsored her renewal, the shelter that fed 40 children a week, the upstairs neighbor's kimchi, and none of those loyalties left room to explain herself to a mother 4,000 miles away who still pictured Korea as a place her daughter was merely passing through. The debt collectors did not disappear because she had stared them down once. 3 nights after the alley, she found a note wedged into the bakery's delivery door, unsigned, informing her that debts followed people, and so did the men who collected them. She did not tell Mr. Yang because Mr. Yang would worry and could do nothing, and she did not tell her employer because her employer's patience for anything that smelled like police involvement was famously short. She told no one, and instead began locking the bakery's back door from the inside during her shift, and began walking the long way to the subway station, past the convenience store where Ji-eun still worked the register with a bruise of exhaustion under each eye that had nothing to do with any collector and everything to do with raising a child alone on a wage that never stretched far enough. It was on one of those long walks, 4 days after the tower man had stood too long in the shelter doorway, that a car eased alongside her at walking pace, window lowering to reveal not the chairman but his driver, an older man named Choi, who spoke gently and explained that Mr. Han would like to speak with her, at her convenience, regarding the incident at the shelter. Adieze kept walking. She had been approached by cars before, in another life, for reasons that were never as polite as they sounded, and she told Choi, without slowing her pace, that she did not discuss her business with strangers in vehicles. The window rose, the car did not follow, but it did not leave the street either, and from the second-floor window of the convenience store, Ji-eun watched the whole exchange with an expression Adieze would not understand until much later. Han Tae-min had inherited many things from his father, but the habit that served him worst in ordinary life was the instinct to solve every closed door with a larger key. When the woman refused Choi's polite approach, his first thought was to have his office draft a formal invitation on company letterhead, the kind of gesture that opened most doors in Seoul without resistance. His assistant, a sharp young woman named Soo Jin who had worked for him long enough to say what others wouldn't, told him plainly that a letterhead invitation to a woman who had just spent a week being chased by his own subsidiary's collectors would read as a threat dressed as an olive branch, and that if he actually wanted to speak to her, he would have to go himself, without the car, without the title, and explain what he wanted before she had any reason to give him the benefit of the doubt. So he went back to the shelter on a Saturday morning, in a plain coat instead of the suit, and found Adaize in the small courtyard behind the kitchen hanging laundry, donated blankets, dozens of them, pinned in rows against a gray sky threatening rain. He introduced himself properly this time, full name, and watched her place him instantly, the recognition passing over her face like a shadow crossing a field, because everyone in that part of the city knew the name Han, even if they had never met the man attached to it. She did not stop pinning blankets. He told her, without rehearsal this time, that the loan office harassing Ji-eun operated under a subsidiary his family's conglomerate technically owned, that he had not known about the specific case until she forced it into his attention by refusing to look away from it, and that he was there to tell her the debt had been voided and the collectors reassigned, effective that morning. Adaize finally turned to face him fully, a wet blanket still gripped in both hands, and asked him the question that would define everything that followed. Not thank you, not how kind, but whether he had come to fix the one case he'd been embarrassed into noticing, or whether he intended to look at what else his name was attached to that he had never bothered to read. Taemin had prepared for gratitude, he had not prepared for an audit. He stood in the wet courtyard turning the question over, aware that Sujin's warning had been correct in a way he hadn't anticipated, that this woman was not going to make it easy for him to feel good about himself, and that some part of him, long starved of being challenged rather than agreed with, found that he did not want her to. He did not have an answer to her question that day, and he told her so, which surprised them both. What he offered instead, standing in the drizzle that had finally started, was smaller and stranger than anything his assistant would have advised. A standing arrangement where the shelter's Friday donation box, previously a haphazard collection of whatever local businesses felt like giving that week, would instead receive a weekly delivery arranged through his office. No press release, no plaque, nothing with his name on it. Adaize asked why Friday specifically, and he admitted, a little unevenly, that Friday was the day his father used to take him to the temple as a boy, before the strokes and the boardrooms, and that it was the only day of the week that still felt like it belonged to someone other than the company. It was an oddly personal thing to hand a stranger, and he seemed to realize it only after he'd said it, color rising faintly at his collar. Adaize did not soften toward him because of the confession. She told him plainly that she had watched wealthy men perform generosity before, back home and here, and that performance always eventually asked for something back, a photograph, a story, a favor called in at an inconvenient hour. Taemin said he understood the suspicion and would not ask her to abandon it, only to let the deliveries continue and judge him by whether they stopped the moment it became inconvenient. It was not romantic, it was not even particularly warm, but it was specific in a way that performance rarely bothered to be, and Adaize, who had spent 4 years cataloging the difference between people who meant what they said and people who merely sounded like they did, filed the exchange away without deciding yet which kind he was. That first Friday box arrived precisely at 6 in the evening, carried not by a courier but by Choi, the driver, who set it down without comment and left before anyone could thank him. Inside were rice sacks, a case of children's vitamins, and, tucked at the bottom where only Adaize would find it, a pair of small new shoes in Ji-eun's son's size, the tags still on, identical in every way to the ones that had started the whole thing, except that this time, nobody was running from anyone to deliver them. The Friday deliveries continued through December without interruption, and Adaize noticed, the way she noticed everything, that they never repeated themselves. One week it was rice and blankets. Another week it was a box of second-hand winter coats, sized correctly for the shelter's specific children rather than assorted generically, which meant someone on Taemin's side had actually asked Mr. Yang for measurements instead of guessing. She began, without deciding to, watching for Choi's car on Friday afternoons the way she watched the oven timer, not anxious, just aware, a small appointment her body had learned to keep. Twice, Taemin came himself instead of sending Choi, always in the plain coat, never the suit, and both times he stayed only long enough to help carry boxes in from the car, which he did badly, stacking them wrong, until Adaize took over without a word and he let her. He started asking questions on those visits, not about her past exactly, but about the mechanics of her days, how she managed both the bakery shift and the volunteer mornings, whether the landlord had ever fixed the heating he'd promised, what she cooked when she was too tired to cook properly. She answered plainly, offering nothing extra, and in exchange asked her own questions with the same bluntness, about his father's condition, about why a man who ran a construction empire didn't know his own subsidiary's business practices, about whether Soo-jin was paid enough for having to manage him. He answered those too, more honestly than he answered anyone at the office, in part because nobody at the office asked, and in part because there was something in the particular quality of her attention. She listened the way she needed dough, patient and thorough, like she intended to use every part of what she was given. On the last Friday before the new year, he arrived later than usual, after the shelter's evening meal had already been cleared, and found Adaize alone in the kitchen scrubbing the last of the pots, the radio playing something in Korean she was humming along to slightly off-key. He told her, standing in the doorway with the box still in his arms, that his father had asked about her, not by name, since Taemin had never given one, but had noticed the change in his son's Fridays and asked, with the bluntness stroke survivors sometimes gained in place of the tact they'd lost, whether there was a woman involved. Adaize set down the pot she was scrubbing and asked, evenly, what he had told him. Taemin said he hadn't answered yet, because he didn't have an answer that felt true, and the honesty of that non-answer sat between them in the warm kitchen air, far longer than either of them tried to fill it. Jiun's son, a serious 6-year-old named Min-jun, who had adopted Adaize as an honorary aunt sometime in October, was the one who first said the thing neither adult had said aloud. He had taken to doing his reading homework at the shelter's back table while his mother finished her shift at the convenience store, and Adaize had taken to sitting with him, sounding out Korean characters slower than he did, and letting him correct her, a reversal that delighted him more than almost anything else in his small, orderly life. Taemin, arriving one Friday to find the two of them hunched over a workbook, sugar flour still on Adaize's hands from the day's baking, sat down across from them without being asked and began, unprompted, helping Min-jun with a math problem instead of the reading, drawing little diagrams of apples being divided among friends, until the boy understood remainders in a way his overworked mother hadn't had the evening hours to explain. Min-jun, watching the two adults across the table with the frank assessment particular to children, announced that Adaize smiled differently when Taemin was there, a fact delivered as flatly as a math answer and met with silence from both adults, one of whom developed a sudden interest in the workbook's cover and the other in the state of her flour-dusted hands. The boy was not wrong, though neither of them would have called what happened a smile so much as a loosening, an unclenching of something Adaize kept wound tight the rest of the week, a version of herself that surfaced only around this table, this kitchen, this particular arrangement of people who had nothing obligating them to be kind to one another and chose it anyway. It became, without either of them naming it, a kind of Friday ritual layered on top of the delivery ritual. Taemin stayed later, helped with homework badly disguised as helping carry boxes, and once, when Min-jun fell asleep against Adaize's arm, waiting for his mother's shift to end, Taemin carried the sleeping boy out to Jiun's car himself, careful and unpracticed in a way that told Adaize, watching from the doorway, that whatever else this man was, he had spent very little of his adult life being useful with his hands, and was trying anyway. Jiun, thanking him at the car window, glanced back at Adaize in the lit doorway and said something too quiet for either of them to hear over the engine, and Taemin's shoulders, walking back, carried the particular stiffness of a man who had just been told something he did not know how to respond to. The bakery owner, a brisk woman named Mrs. Song who had sponsored Adaize's work visa 4 years earlier and never let her forget the risk it represented, called Adaize into the back office on a Tuesday in January with a magazine folded open on the desk between them. It was not a tabloid, not yet, but a Business Weekly's society page, a grainy photograph taken from across a street of Taemin, helping Adaize carry a box through the shelter's gate, both of them unposed, unaware, captioned only with his name and a question mark about what business the Han heir had with an unnamed foreign shelter worker. Mrs. Song did not raise her voice. She reminded Adaize, in the careful tone of someone delivering unwelcome facts as a kindness, that her sponsorship agreement required her employer to vouch for her conduct, and that conduct which drew press attention, however innocent, made that vouching harder to sustain, especially conduct involving a man whose family's business dealings were, in Mrs. Song's words, not always as clean as their glass towers suggested. Adaize left the office and did the math she had been doing, in some form, since the night at the fence, what this cost her, concretely, in the currency that mattered, Her visa depended on Mrs. Song's goodwill, her goodwill depended on invisibility, and invisibility was no longer available to her, not after a stranger with a camera had decided her Friday afternoons were worth a caption. She did not call Taemin that night. She sat in her one room above the laundromat with the magazine page, which she had taken from Mrs. Song's desk without asking, spread on the small table, and calculated with the same patience she brought to dividing dough into equal portions, what she would lose if this ended here, what she stood to lose if it continued, and whether either number was one she could live inside. Her mother's Sunday call came 2 days early that week, which meant Mrs. Song, or someone at the bakery, had already found a way to reach Enugu with the story reshaped into something alarming. Her mother did not ask about the money this time. She asked, voice tight across the distance, whether Adaize understood what happened to foreign women who got tangled up with powerful Korean families, whether she had thought about what would happen to her when the family decided the entertainment was over, and Adaize, gripping the phone in the dark of her small kitchen, found she did not have an answer that would satisfy either her mother or herself. Sujin brought the same magazine to Taemin's desk before he had seen it himself, laying it down without comment and watching his face for the reaction she had already predicted. He read the caption twice, the question mark at the end of it landing harder than any accusation would have, and asked her directly what she thought he should do. Sujin, who had earned the right to be blunt with him over 3 years of cleaning up messes he hadn't meant to make, told him that the photograph itself was harmless, but that harmless photographs became dangerous the moment his grandmother's faction on the board decided to use them as leverage in the succession argument that had been simmering since his father's stroke, that a chairman's heir photographed in unexplained proximity to a foreign shelter worker was, to men who had spent decades consolidating marriages and mergers with equal calculation, either a scandal to be managed or a weakness to be exploited, and they would choose whichever served them better. He had known in the abstract that his family treated his personal life as an extension of corporate strategy. He had simply never before had a personal life specific enough to be treated that way. His grandmother summoned him to the family's traditional Hanok residence 2 days later, tea ceremony formal despite the informality of the hour, and told him without preamble that the board's more conservative members were already asking whether the Han name needed the complication of a foreign entanglement during a succession fight this delicate, and that she expected him to end whatever this was before it became something the family had to formally address. Taemin sat across from her in the tea room where he had knelt as a boy learning the difference between his father's expectations and his own, and told her, with a steadiness that surprised him as he said it, that he had not decided what this was yet, and that he did not intend to let anyone else decide it for him on a schedule set by a board meeting. His grandmother's expression did not change, which was, in the language their family had always spoken instead of raised voices, its own kind of verdict. She told him he had 2 weeks to resolve his own ambivalence before she resolved it for him, and Taemin left the Hanok that evening with the particular cold clarity of a man who had just been given a deadline for a decision he had been avoiding making even to himself. Adaize did not hear about the 2-week deadline directly, but she felt its pressure arrive the way she felt weather changing, in small shifts she couldn't yet name. The Friday deliveries continued, but Choi came alone now, and when Adaize asked after Taemin, the older driver's answers grew shorter and more careful, the answers of a man protecting someone rather than informing someone. Mr. Yang, meanwhile, had begun fielding calls from a woman identifying herself as an assistant to the Han family's public relations office, asking pointed, polite questions about the nature of the shelter's relationship with Mr. Han. Questions that made Mr. Yang increasingly nervous about a donor relationship he had never asked to become a controversy. It was Min Jun, again, who forced the conversation neither adult was having. He asked Adaize directly, over his workbook, why the man who helped with his math homework hadn't come in 3 weeks, and whether Adaize had made him angry, a child's blunt logic cutting straight to a question the adults had been dressing in politer language. Adaize told him honestly that she didn't know, which was true, and that it wasn't his fault, which was also true, and privately did the accounting again. 3 weeks of silence after 2 months of Fridays, measured against a mother whose Sunday calls had turned into daily texts asking when Adaize planned to come home, measured against a visa renewal meeting with Mrs. Song scheduled for the following month that suddenly felt less certain than it had in October. She wrote him a message finally, not asking where he had gone but stating plainly that if the Friday deliveries were becoming a liability for his family, she would rather he say so directly than let Choi's silences say it for him, because she had spent 4 years in this country learning to read exactly that kind of silence and had no patience left for reading his. The reply came within the hour, longer than anything he had sent her before, admitting the board pressure, admitting the deadline, admitting that his family had spent his entire adult life training him to treat every relationship as a liability calculation, and that some part of him had been running that calculation about her without meaning to, and hated himself for it. He asked if he could come Friday, not with a box this time, just to talk. Adayeze read the message twice in the dim light of her kitchenette and did not answer it for 6 hours, turning over what it would cost her to say yes, and what it would cost her, differently but just as truly, to say no. He came on Friday without the box, as promised, and found her not in the kitchen but in the courtyard, sitting on the same overturned crate Jian had once trembled on, arms wrapped around her knees against the January cold. He sat beside her without asking permission, close enough to matter and far enough to respect the space she hadn't offered him, and told her everything he had not managed to fit into the message, that his grandmother's ultimatum was real, that the board's concern was less about Adayeze specifically than about the precedent of the family's public face being anything other than strategically arranged, and that he had spent 3 weeks discovering he resented every single person telling him what his life was supposed to look like, which was, he admitted, the first honest feeling he'd had about the whole succession fight since his father's stroke. Adayeze listened without interrupting, the old habit of patience she brought to everything, and when he finished, she told him something he hadn't expected, that she understood the calculation better than he thought, because she had been doing her own version of it every single day since the night at the fence, weighing her visa against her conscience, her mother's fear against her own judgment, what she owed the people who depended on her against what she owed herself. She told him she was not interested in being a problem he solved by defying his family in one dramatic gesture and then discovering, 6 months later, that he'd traded one kind of pressure for another he hadn't accounted for. She told him plainly that if this was going to continue, it needed to survive ordinary Tuesdays, not just brave Fridays, that she had watched enough performances of courage to know the difference between a decision and a mood. Taemin sat with that for a long moment, the cold settling into both of them, and then said the truest thing he had said to anyone in years, that he did not know yet whether he was brave enough for what she was describing, but that he wanted to find out, and that he would rather find out slowly, honestly, and in front of his family, than lose the only Fridays that had ever felt like they belonged to him. It was not a declaration. It was smaller than that, and steadier, and Adayeze, listening to the specific quality of his uncertainty, found it more convincing than any grand promise would have been. She did not answer him that night either. But she did not send him away, and when Choi's car finally pulled up to take him home, Taemin left with something that had not been there 3 weeks earlier, a Friday that had survived being questioned. The visa renewal meeting with Mrs. Song arrived on a gray Wednesday in February, and Adayeze walked into the bakery's back office prepared for the worst version of the conversation, the one where 4 years of reliable work counted for less than one blurry photograph in a business weekly. Mrs. Song did not open with the magazine. She opened by sliding the renewal paperwork across the desk already signed, and told Adayeze, in a tone that had softened considerably since January, that she had done what she should have done from the start, which was ask around rather than assume, that 2 of her regular customers worked in the Han family's philanthropic office and had confirmed, independently, that the Friday deliveries were real, unpublicized, and had in fact continued for months with no expectation of credit or return. Mrs. Song admitted, with the particular discomfort of someone correcting themselves aloud, that she had been more afraid of the appearance of scandal than curious about its substance, and that the fear had nearly cost her a worker she'd never once had to discipline in 4 years. It was not an apology exactly, but it was close enough that Adayeze accepted it as one, and left the office with her renewed visa in hand, and a lightness in her chest she hadn't expected the day to produce. She did not call Taemin immediately. She walked instead to the convenience store where Jian worked, and told her the news over the counter between customers, and Jian, setting down the items she was scanning, came around the counter to hug her without asking, the kind of unguarded gesture that Adayeze had learned, over 4 cautious years, to recognize as rare and to receive without flinching away from it. That evening, walking home in the last gray light before the street lamps took over, Adayeze passed the alley where this had all begun, the fence still there, the shadow it cast now ordinary rather than menacing. She stopped for a moment, the way she sometimes did at the sight of something significant, and thought about the version of herself who had stood there 4 months earlier, calculating exactly what listening to a stranger's whisper would cost her. She had been right that it would cost her something. She had not accounted for what it would give her in return, and standing there now with a renewed visa and a Friday that had survived a board's deadline, she allowed herself, for the first time since November, to wonder what came next, rather than simply brace for it. What came next arrived in the form of an invitation Adayeze had not anticipated and would not have chosen. A formal dinner at the Han family residence, arranged by the grandmother herself, ostensibly to thank the shelter for its work with the family's philanthropic donations and, everyone involved understood without saying so, actually to inspect the woman her grandson had refused to give up. Tae-min warned her honestly before she accepted, laying out exactly what she would be walking into, a room full of people who had spent their lives deciding who belonged in rooms like that one, and a grandmother whose courtesy would be immaculate and whose judgment would already be made before Adayeze said a single word. Adayeze told him she had attended harder rooms than that for less reason, which was true, though she did not tell him how many hours she spent afterward deciding what to wear, weighing every choice against the particular scrutiny she knew was coming, before choosing, finally, a deep blue dress and her hair in the natural style she wore on ordinary days, deciding that if she was going to be examined, she would at least be examined as herself. The dinner itself unfolded with the exact chilled precision Tae-min had predicted. The grandmother asked questions that sounded like small talk and functioned like cross-examination, about Adayeze's family in Nigeria, about her plans for the future, about whether she intended to remain in Korea permanently, or whether this was, as the grandmother phrased it with careful neutrality, a chapter rather than a life. Adayeze answered each question directly, without embellishment and without apology, describing her mother's hopes and her brother's school fees and her own uncertain, evolving plans with the same plainness she brought to everything, refusing the grandmother's evident hope that she would either perform gratitude or crack under pressure. It was Minjun's mother, unexpectedly invited at Tae-min's quiet insistence as a character witness nobody had asked for, who tipped the evening's balance. Ji-yeon stood partway through the dessert course, uninvited by protocol but undeterred by it, and told the assembled family plainly what Adayeze had done for her and her son the night of the debt collectors, and every Friday since, without ever being paid or thanked or photographed for it, until a stranger's camera made it a controversy. The grandmother listened to the whole account without interrupting, her expression unreadable, and when Ji-yeon sat back down, the old woman turned to Adayeze and asked one final question, quieter than the rest, whether she understood that loving her grandson would mean inheriting every complication attached to his name. Adayeze answered that she understood it better than anyone in the room, having spent 4 months managing exactly that complication for free, and the room went very still, waiting to see what the grandmother would say next. The grandmother did not answer immediately, and the silence stretched long enough that Soo-jin, seated near the far end of the table, later told Tae-min she had counted 11 full seconds before anyone breathed normally again. When the old woman finally spoke, it was not the verdict anyone expected. She said that she had spent 60 years watching people marry into this family for exactly the reasons Adayeze had just declined to offer, the name, the money, the towers with their reflective glass, and that in 60 years, she had rarely met anyone who spoke to her the way Adayeze just had, without flattery and without fear. She did not say she approved, she said, more carefully, that she would need to observe rather than decide, and that observation would take longer than one dinner, however honest. It was not a victory, not the kind that resolved anything cleanly, but it was a door left open rather than closed, and Tae-min, walking Adayeze to Choi's waiting car afterward, told her he hadn't expected even that much, that his grandmother's caution over the decades had hardened into something closer to permanent refusal for every previous person he'd ever hesitantly introduced. Adayeze, still feeling the weight of the evening in her shoulders, told him she hadn't done it for his grandmother's benefit, that she had simply refused to shrink herself into whatever shape the room wanted, because she had learned a long time ago that shrinking never actually satisfied the people demanding it. It only invited them to ask for a little more. The dinner's aftermath rippled outward in ways neither of them fully controlled. The business weekly that had run the original photograph followed up within days with a second piece, this one considerably less speculative, quoting an unnamed source close to the family describing a serious relationship and a grandmother's cautious blessing, and the tone of coverage shifted overnight from scandal to interest, the particular Korean media hunger for redemption arcs finding, in Adayeze's plain refusal to perform gratitude, exactly the kind of story it preferred to tell. Adayeze found herself recognized, twice in 1 week, by strangers at the subway station, an experience that unsettled her more than the collectors ever had, because collectors she knew how to face directly, and public curiosity had no fence to stand behind while she decided how much of herself to show it. The board's conservative faction denied the scandal they had hoped to leverage, shifted their strategy within the month, and the new approach was subtler and, in its way, more dangerous than collectors at an alley or photographers across a street. A senior board member, a cousin of Taemin's father named Director O, requested a private meeting with Adayeze through channels that bypassed Taemin entirely, arranged instead through Mrs. Song, whose bakery, it turned out, held a commercial lease with a Han-affiliated property company that could be renewed generously or made suddenly, administratively difficult. Adayeze understood the message embedded in the invitation before she ever sat down across from Director O in a private tea room near the bakery, that her employer's business, and by extension her own livelihood, could be quietly leveraged if she did not make the sensible choice herself. Director O was polite, even warm, in the particular Korean register reserved for delivering ultimatums as favors. He told her that the family would be prepared to offer her a generous sum, framed as support for her education or her family back home, in exchange for a quiet, dignified withdrawal from Taemin's life before the relationship became something the company's shareholders would have to formally address ahead of the annual succession vote. He assured her this was not an insult but a kindness, sparing her the ongoing scrutiny, sparing her family the international attention, sparing everyone the complication. Adayeze listened to the entire offer without interrupting, the same patience she brought to every difficult conversation, and then told him that she had come to Korea with nothing and built, slowly and without shortcuts, a life she was proud of, and that she had no intention of selling the one part of that life that had never once asked her to shrink herself for a sum of money that would evaporate long before the shame of taking it did. She left the tea room and did not tell Taemin immediately, turning the encounter over first, weighing whether reporting it would look like she was using it as leverage of her own, whether silence would look like complicity if it ever came out later, whether either choice protected Mrs. Song's lease or endangered it further. She decided, finally, walking the long way home past the alley and the fence and all the small landmarks of the last 5 months, that the one thing she would not do again was manage a threat alone in the dark the way she had the very first night, and she took out her phone to call him before she reached her own front door. Taemin's reaction to the account of Director O's offer was not the explosive anger Adayeze had half expected, but something colder and more focused, the particular fury of a man who had spent his whole life being maneuvered by people who called it strategy. He asked her, first, whether she was safe, whether Mrs. Song's lease was actually at risk or merely implied to be, and only after satisfying himself on both counts did he say that he intended to bring the offer directly to the full board, rather than let Director O continue operating through side channels and implied threats to bakeries. Adayeze told him plainly that she had not called him for rescue, only so that he would not learn about it later and wonder why she had hidden it, a distinction he absorbed slowly, the way he absorbed most things that required him to separate her independence from his instinct to fix things on her behalf. The board meeting, when it happened 2 weeks later, was not the dramatic confrontation either of them had privately imagined. Taemin presented Director O's offer as what it was, an attempted bribe of an employee's livelihood, used as leverage against his personal life, and watched the room's temperature shift as several board members who had stayed neutral through the earlier scandal now recognized a liability of a different kind. Not the relationship itself, but a senior director conducting quiet coercion that could, if it ever surfaced publicly, cost the company considerably more than any romance ever would. Director O was censured, quietly, in the particular bloodless way corporate boards discipline their own, and Mrs. Song's lease renewal arrived the following week, with terms slightly better than her previous one, an outcome nobody officially connected to anything. Adayeze heard about the board meeting secondhand, from Soo-jin over coffee near the shelter, and felt something unclench in her chest that she hadn't fully realized was still clenched. Not relief exactly, but the specific settling that comes from watching a threat resolve through a process rather than through her own constant vigilance. She asked Soo-jin, half-joking, whether this meant the family had finally accepted her, and Soo-jin, stirring her coffee with a careful expression, told her that acceptance and tolerance were not the same thing, and that the grandmother's observation period, whatever its outcome, was not yet finished. Spring arrived in Seoul the way it always did, abruptly, cherry blossoms crowding the riverbanks within a single warm week, and Adaeze found herself on a Sunday afternoon in April, walking along the Han River with Taemin for the first time, somewhere that was neither the shelter nor a family dinner nor a tea room built for negotiation. Just a path crowded with families and couples and a boy selling bootleg blossom-shaped balloons, ordinary in a way neither of them had been allowed to be together yet. Minjun ran ahead of them, chasing a duck that had wandered too close to a food cart, Jiyeon laughing as she called him back, and Taemin watched the boy with an expression Adaeze had come to recognize, the specific softness he reserved for the parts of this new life he hadn't known he was missing. They stopped at a railing overlooking the water, the towers of Yeouido visible downriver, glass catching the late afternoon light, and Taemin told her, without preamble, that his grandmother had finally reached her verdict that morning. Not a blessing exactly, the old woman was too careful for anything so unconditional, but an acknowledgement delivered over breakfast that she would no longer stand in the way, and a request, phrased as a request only in form, that Adaeze come to the family's ancestral rites in May, the ceremony where the extended family honored their dead and by long tradition formally introduced anyone being considered a lasting addition to it. Adaeze absorbed the news slowly, watching the water rather than his face, and told him honestly that part of her was relieved and part of her was still braced for the next test, because 5 months of scrutiny had trained her body to expect one even when none was coming. Taemin said he understood that better than he wished he did, that his own family had spent his whole life teaching him to treat every calm moment as the pause before the next negotiation, and that the two of them, in their different ways, were going to have to teach each other how to simply stand at a railing and watch a river without calculating what it would cost. He reached for her hand then, first time in public, and she let him take it, watching the water move past the glass towers toward the sea, the balloon boy's cart bell ringing somewhere behind them, ordinary and unremarkable and entirely new. The ancestral rites took place at the family's countryside estate 2 hours outside Seoul, a sprawling hanok compound Taemin's great-grandfather had built, and successive generations had preserved with the particular reverence Korean families reserved for the physical proof of their own history. Adaeze arrived in a hanbok the grandmother's own seamstress had made for her, indigo and gold, a gesture Adaeze understood to be both genuine welcome and final examination folded into a single bolt of silk. She had spent the drive out rehearsing the order of bows, the correct way to hold the ceremonial cup. Every detail Sujin had patiently drilled into her over 3 coaching sessions, determined that whatever judgment the extended family passed on her, it would not be for failing to show respect she was fully capable of showing. The ceremony itself unfolded across the better part of a day, incense and formal bows before the ancestral table. Cousins and uncles and second cousins Adaeze had never met, studying her with varying degrees of open curiosity, and she moved through it with the same steady patience that had carried her through every difficult room since November, answering questions in careful, correct Korean, bowing when instructed, holding herself with a dignity that owed nothing to performance and everything to simply refusing to be smaller than the moment required. It was during the final course of the shared meal, extended family seated at long tables under lanterns strung between old pine trees, that Taemin's grandmother rose, unprompted, and asked the gathered family for their attention. She spoke for several minutes about tradition, about the weight of the Han name, about the 60 years she had spent guarding it from people who wanted the name more than the family attached to it, and the room listened with the practiced patience of people who had heard variations of this speech at every family gathering for decades. Then she said something none of them had heard before, that she had spent 5 months testing a woman who had never once asked to be tested, who had refused money, refused to disappear quietly, refused to perform gratitude for scrutiny she hadn't invited, and who had, in the process, taught an old woman something she thought she'd forgotten how to learn, that the family's dignity was never in the name at all, but in who chose, freely and at real cost to themselves, to stand beside it anyway. She turned to Adaeze and asked her, in front of the assembled family, whether she still wished to be considered part of this complicated, demanding inheritance, now that she had seen the whole weight of it laid bare across a single dinner table. Adaeze stood at the head of that long table with every eye in the courtyard on her, and thought, briefly and with a clarity that surprised her, of the plastic bag with the child's shoes still inside it, of the fence in Yeongdeungpo, of every calculation she had made in the 5 months since about what this would cost her, and whether the cost was one she could survive. She told the grandmother and the assembled family that she did not want to be considered an addition to the Han inheritance, because inheritance implied something handed down rather than chosen, and she had not spent 4 years building a life in this country brick by brick just to become a line item in someone else's legacy. What she wanted, if the family was asking, was to be considered a partner in whatever Taemin built from here forward, someone who had opinions about the shape of it rather than a passenger inside it, and she said this plainly, in Korean, without apology, watching several of the older relatives exchange glances that suggested this was not the answer their traditions had prepared them to expect. The grandmother, to the visible surprise of half the table, laughed, a short, genuine sound that cracked the formality of the evening wide open, and said that she had raised a grandson soft enough to fall for exactly the kind of woman who would refuse to be handed anything, and that perhaps, at 81 years old, this was precisely the correction her family's long habit of arranging everything had needed. She gestured Taemin to his feet, and he crossed the courtyard to stand beside Adeze in front of the entire extended family, and the grandmother, taking both their hands in her own weathered ones, said the formal words that transformed the evening from examination into welcome, words Adeze had practiced in the car, but which landed, spoken aloud in that lantern-lit courtyard, with a weight rehearsal hadn't prepared her for. What followed was not a wedding, not yet, but something adjacent to it in the family's own private grammar, an acknowledgement, witnessed by 3 generations, that whatever came next would be built by 2 people who had chosen each other with open eyes, rather than by a family arranging convenient outcomes. Min Jun, who had been brought along at Ji-eun's insistence because Adaeze had refused to attend without the people who mattered most to her, ran across the courtyard mid-ceremony to hug her legs, entirely unbothered by protocol, and the grandmother, rather than reprimanding him, reached down and ruffled his hair, a gesture that told Adaeze, more than any formal words could have, exactly how far the old woman had actually traveled. The shelter's Friday deliveries never stopped, though their character changed once the family's tension resolved into something closer to peace. Taemin began sending Choi with the boxes again most weeks, but now, roughly once a month, he came himself with Adaeze rather than to visit her, the 2 of them arriving together to help sort donations before sharing the shelter's evening meal with Mr. Yang and whichever children were still finishing homework at the back table. Mrs. Song, whose bakery had become something of a minor local landmark once word spread of its connection to the story the Business Weekly had eventually told in full, gave Adaeze a raise unprompted, and more meaningfully to Adaeze, began sending the shelter's Friday bread order at cost rather than full price, a quiet act of generosity that asked for nothing in return, learned, Adaeze suspected, from watching how the Han deliveries had operated all along. Ji-eun's debt, fully cleared since the winter, had left her enough breathing room to move into a slightly larger apartment near the shelter, and Minjun's math homework had improved enough that his teacher had begun asking, with visible curiosity, what had changed at home. Adaeze visited them both most weeks still, not out of obligation but because the friendship had long since outgrown the debt that started it. The 3 of them bound now by something that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a fence, a plastic bag, and a decision made on a Thursday night in November. Adaeze's mother, informed properly this time rather than through second-hand alarm, had flown to Seoul for the first time in April, met Taemin over a dinner Adaeze had braced for and which had gone, against every expectation, warmly, her mother charmed less by his family's name than by the careful, unshowy way he refilled her water glass without being asked and listened to her stories about Enugu without once checking his phone. Her mother left Korea 2 weeks later, having extracted a promise that Adaeze would visit home for Christmas, a promise Adaeze intended to keep, and having told her daughter, in the airport departure hall, that she finally understood what 4 years of careful, quiet letters home had never quite managed to explain. That her daughter had not simply survived in this country, she had built something in it worth staying for. On the first anniversary of the night at the fence, Adaeze closed the bakery early and walked, alone this time, back to the alley where it had all begun, the November air sharp the same way it had been a year before. The fence was still there, ordinary chain link rusting slightly at the joints, and she stood before it for a long moment the way she sometimes did at the sight of something significant, remembering the specific weight of the plastic bag, the shake in Ji-eun's hands, the two men waiting with the patience of people paid by the hour. She had not known, standing there a year earlier, that a man in a black car had been watching, had not known that the decision to open a gate rather than lock it would eventually deliver her to a lantern-lit courtyard where an 81-year-old woman held her hands and called her family. Tae-min found her there 20 minutes later, having guessed correctly where she'd gone, and stood beside her at the fence without asking why she'd come, understanding by now the particular way she needed to revisit hard places rather than simply move past them. He had brought something with him, wrapped in plain paper, and when she opened it she found a pair of small shoes, adult-sized this time, made by a local cobbler from leather dyed the same terracotta as the head wrap she'd worn the night they met. A gift that made no obvious sense until he explained, a little unevenly, that he'd wanted to give her something that echoed the shoes in the bag without repeating their fear, proof that the object which started their story could mean something entirely different now than it had the night it arrived shaking in a stranger's hands. She laughed, unexpected and full, and told him it was the strangest, most specific gift anyone had ever given her, and exactly the kind of thing she hadn't known she wanted until it was in her hands. They walked back toward the shelter together as the street lamps came on one by one, past the convenience store where Ji-eun waved through the window, past the bakery where Mrs. Song was pulling down the shutter for the night. The whole ordinary neighborhood lit gold against the coming dark, and Adeze thought, for the first time without qualification, that whatever came next, she was no longer calculating what it would cost her to stay. She had already paid the only price that mattered the night she opened a gate instead of closing it, and everything since had simply been the interest returning, slow and steady, on a debt the city had finally, fully repaid.